What happens when a group of racist men targets the wrong elderly black woman, thinking no one is watching? Watch as the group of men quickly realize their grave mistake when the woman's son spots the commotion. This is the powerful story of a resilient mother and her son, whose determination and courage turn the tables in an unforgettable way. From a quiet afternoon in the park to a gripping manhunt, watch as justice is served and the strength of family and perseverance triumphs over hate. You won't believe how it all unfolds. The golden afternoon sun streamed through the trees, casting dappled patterns on the paved path winding through the park. Loretta Johnson sat on a weathered bench near the fountain, her favorite spot. The rhythmic splash of water mixed with the distant laughter of children playing on the jungle gym, creating an ambiance of peace. She adjusted her sun hat, smiling softly at the thought of her son, Isaiah, who had promised to meet her after work. Loretta loved these moments. Quiet afternoons where she could savor the outdoors. At 70, her knees were no longer as strong as they once were, and long walks weren't easy anymore. But the bench near the fountain was her haven, and her weekly strolls with Isaiah were her joy. She glanced at her watch. He was running late, but that wasn't unusual. His work as an FBI agent often kept him busy, and she didn't mind waiting. A shadow passed over her face, momentarily dimming her smile. 3 men were walking toward her from the other side of the path. Their laughter carried through the air, sharp and jarring, an unsettling contrast to the park's tranquility. They seemed out of place, middle-aged, dressed in rough jeans and scuffed boots, their movements deliberate and eyes scanning the park with an edge of hostility. Loretta's heart sank as she saw them glance her way, their steps slowing. One of them, a wiry man with a sneer that seemed permanently etched onto his face, nudged his larger companion and nodded in her direction. The third man, shorter but no less intimidating, smirked. "Hey, lady," the wiry one called out, his voice tinged with mockery. "Nice day for a stroll, huh?" Loretta stiffened but didn't reply. She sat straighter, her hands gripping her purse tightly. The men exchanged amused glances and began to veer toward her bench, their laughter turning into low chuckles. She scanned the park, noting how the once busy paths seemed to have emptied, leaving her feeling exposed. She glanced at the entrance, willing Isaiah to appear, but he was nowhere in sight. Her breath quickened as she turned her gaze back to the approaching men. They were closer now, their smirks widening as they closed the distance. The men reached Loretta's bench, their footsteps slowing as they exchanged amused glances. Paul, the wiry leader, stopped a few feet away, tilting his head as if sizing her up. His smirk carried a sharp edge, but Loretta pretended not to notice, keeping her gaze fixed on the fountain in front of her. "Nice afternoon, isn't it?" Paul said, his voice casual but tinged with something unpleasant. "Out here all by yourself, huh?" Loretta looked up, offering a polite but reserved smile. "It is a nice day. The park's beautiful this time of year." Her calm response seemed to irritate him. Paul's smirk faltered before returning, sharper this time. "You come here often, lady? Or just wandering where you don't belong?" Loretta adjusted her purse on her lap, still projecting outward composure. "I'm just waiting for my son. We walk here together every week." Paul chuckled, glancing back at his companions. Troy, the taller, bulkier man, let out a low laugh, while Gary, the smaller one, grinned, but said nothing. "Waiting for your son. Hope he's not too far away." Something in his tone made Loretta uneasy, but she kept her posture relaxed. "He'll be here soon," she replied, her voice even. She glanced at her watch, willing time to move faster. Isaiah was never late. Surely he'd arrive any moment. Troy stepped closer, his heavy boots scraping against the pavement. "Must be nice, having family to wait on. Some people don't know when they've got it good." Loretta didn't answer, hoping silence would discourage them. Instead, Paul crouched slightly, bringing himself to her eye level. "What's the matter? We just want to have a little chat. You look like a smart lady. Don't you want to be polite?" Loretta met his gaze, her expression neutral but firm. "I don't see why we need to chat at all." The men exchanged glances, their amusement growing. "Oh, she's got a little attitude," Paul said, standing upright again. "That's okay. We like a challenge." Troy laughed louder this time, moving closer to the bench. "Yeah, we do. Don't we, Gary?" Gary shrugged, still smirking. "She's got some nerve. I'll give her that." Paul's expression darkened slightly. He stepped closer, resting a hand on the back of the bench. "You know, lady, not everyone's so lucky. Some people got to work hard for their spot in the world, but here you are, just sitting pretty. Doesn't seem fair, does it?" Loretta's heart began to beat faster, but she didn't let it show. "Everyone deserves to enjoy the park," she said calmly, though her grip on her purse tightened. She glanced again at the path leading to the park entrance. It remained empty. Paul's sneer returned. "Yeah, sure, everyone. But some people don't belong here, you know? They make it uncomfortable for the rest of us." The air around her seemed to thicken. Loretta glanced at the fountain, letting its steady rhythm ground her. "I don't know what you mean by that." "Oh, I think you do," Paul said, his voice dripping with mockery. "But hey, maybe you'll get the hint if we spell it out for you." Troy kicked the edge of the bench, the sudden jolt making Loretta jump slightly. She stiffened, her jaw tightening. "There's no need for that," she said, her tone still calm but firmer now. "No need," Troy repeated, laughing. "Come on, lady. Don't act like you don't know what this is." Loretta looked between the three men, her unease growing. "If you're trying to scare me, it won't work." Paul grinned, leaning in slightly. "Oh, we're not trying to scare you. We're just saying, maybe this park isn't the best place for someone like you." Loretta's stomach turned, but she refused to rise to their bait. Instead, she let out a slow breath, lifting her chin slightly. "I have every right to be here," Paul chuckled, shaking his head. "Rights. There's that word again." He exchanged a knowing look with Troy and Gary. "You hear that? She's got rights." Troy's laugh was louder this time, more menacing. He moved closer, his shadow falling over Loretta. "Yeah, sure you do, but maybe you'd be safer somewhere else." Paul reached out, resting his hand lightly on her arm. The casual gesture carried an undercurrent of menace. Loretta stiffened, but didn't pull away, her voice sharp as she said, "Take your hand off me." Paul's grin widened, but he let go, stepping back. "Relax, lady. We're just having a little fun." Loretta's breath came quicker now, though she struggled to keep her composure. Her eyes flickered to the park entrance once more. Still empty. Where was Isaiah? Paul followed her gaze, smirking. "You waiting for someone to come save you? Hate to break it to you, but this ain't a fairy tale." Troy and Gary closed in slightly, boxing her in. Loretta's voice trembled as she spoke again, her calm slipping. "You'll regret this." Paul tilted his head, feigning curiosity. "Oh yeah? Why's that?" Her answer was quiet, more of a whispered hope than a threat. "Because my son will be here." Paul and the others laughed, their cruel amusement echoing through the park. Paul and the others laughed, their cruel amusement echoing through the park. "Your son, huh?" Paul said, shaking his head as though she'd just delivered the punchline of a joke. "Lady, let me break it to you gently. Your son's not here, and he's not going to save you." Troy leaned against the bench, his arms crossed, looming over Loretta. "Even if he was, what's he gonna do? Call the cops? Like they'd believe you over us." "Yeah," Gary added with a chuckle. "They'd take one look at you and figure you're just trying to make trouble. Probably charge you for wasting their time." Paul's smirk widened as he stepped closer, his presence suffocating. "That's the thing about people like you, always thinking someone's gonna come running to help. But out here, it's just us, and we make the rules." Loretta's fingers curled around her purse strap, her heart pounding, but she kept her voice calm. "I don't need anyone to help me, and I don't need to explain myself to you." Paul raised an eyebrow, his smirk twitching. "Oh, she's got some fight in her. That's cute, but let's get one thing straight. You're not walking away from here without giving us a little something for our trouble." "What trouble?" Loretta shot back, her tone sharpening. "You came over here uninvited. I didn't ask you for anything." Troy let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "This one's got a mouth on her." Thinks she can talk her way out of this. She's wasting her time, Gary said, eyeing her purse greedily. Why don't we just get it over with? Paul held up a hand, silencing them. Patience, boys. No need to rush. We're just having a conversation, aren't we, lady? He crouched slightly, his face level with hers, the smile on his lips chilling. You wouldn't want to ruin the mood by being rude now, would you? Loretta held her ground, though her grip on the purse tightened. I don't owe you anything, she said firmly. Not my time. Not my belongings. Paul's expression darkened, the faux charm slipping. See? That's the thing. We weren't asking. It's not about what you owe us. It's about what we're taking. Loretta's chest tightened as the weight of his words settled in. You wouldn't dare, she said, her voice quieter now. Wouldn't we? Paul straightened, glancing at Troy and Gary. What do you think, boys? You think the lady's right? Or do you think she's bluffing? Troy chuckled, stepping closer. I think she's got something she doesn't want us to see. Bet she's hiding something good in that bag, Gary added, his grin growing wider. And that necklace? That's got to be worth something. Loretta's hand instinctively rose to her necklace, her thumb brushing against the small ring hanging from the chain. Her voice dropped, carrying a warning. Don't touch me. Paul tilted his head, feigning surprise. Touch you? Oh no, lady. We'd never dream of it. His voice turned cold as he grabbed the bench beside her, leaning in. Unless you make us. Loretta's pulse quickened, but she refused to look away. You're making a mistake, she said, her voice low but steady. Paul laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the quiet park. Mistake? No, lady. The mistake is you thinking you're untouchable. Out here? Nobody cares. Nobody's coming. Gary shifted behind her, his fingers brushing the edge of her purse strap. Loretta jerked back, but Troy was quicker, stepping in to block her path. You heard him, Troy said, his voice a low growl. Just hand it over, and we'll be on our way. No, Loretta snapped, her grip tightening on the purse. I said no. Paul straightened, his eyes narrowing. Last chance, lady. Don't make us take it. Loretta's hands trembled, but she held firm. You'll regret this, she whispered, her voice laced with defiance. Paul's smirk returned, cruel and triumphant. We'll take our chances. With a quick motion, Troy grabbed the purse, yanking it hard. Loretta's grip faltered, and the bag slipped from her hands. She gasped, her voice rising in protest. Give it back! Gary laughed, rummaging through the bag. What do we have here? Wallet, some cash. Not bad. Don't stop there, Paul ordered, his attention shifting to the necklace. That, too. Loretta raised a hand to protect the chain. No, she said, her voice shaking. You're not taking this. Paul reached for the necklace, his patience wearing thin. It's not up to you, lady. Let her go. The deep, commanding voice froze the men in their tracks. They turned as one, startled by the sudden interruption. Standing at the edge of the path was a tall man, his broad shoulders taut with tension. His eyes burned with restrained fury, his hands clenched at his sides. Paul's grip on Loretta's necklace faltered as he faced the newcomer. And who the hell are you supposed to be? The man stepped closer, his voice low and steady. Her son. Isaiah's words hung in the air like a warning shot, his steady tone daring any of the men to make the next move. Paul tilted his head, his smirk faltering just slightly as he tried to mask the unease in his eyes. Your son, huh? He said, his voice dripping with mockery. Guess she wasn't lying after all. But let me tell you something, tough guy. You're a little late. Isaiah ignored him, his gaze shifting to Loretta. Mom, are you okay? His voice was calm, but the tension simmering beneath it was palpable. Loretta nodded, her trembling hand brushing over the necklace Paul had tried to steal. I'm fine, she said quietly, though her eyes betrayed the fear she had just endured. Now that you're here, Paul laughed, though the sound was more forced than before. Fine? Yeah, she's fine. We were just teaching her a lesson. Some people need a little reminder about who runs things around here. Isaiah's jaw tightened, his body still but coiled like a spring. You call this a lesson? Harassing an elderly woman? Stealing from her? You don't run anything. Troy stepped forward, his bulk adding weight to the conversation. "And what are you going to do about it? Call the cops? Like we said, no one's going to believe her. Or you." Isaiah's eyes flicked toward Troy, his expression unchanging. "Try me." Gary shifted uncomfortably behind the others, his earlier bravado slipping. "Maybe we should just let it go, Paul. We got the purse, didn't we?" Paul spun around, his glare cutting into Gary. "You think this is about the purse? It's about respect. Something people like them don't deserve unless they're taught the hard way." Isaiah stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and Paul. "Respect? Is that what you call this?" His voice dropped, his calm tone laced with steel. "You don't even know the meaning of the word." Paul squared his shoulders, stepping forward to meet Isaiah. The space between them was almost non-existent now, their gazes locked like opposing forces about to collide. "Big words for someone who's outnumbered," Paul sneered. Isaiah didn't flinch. Outnumbered doesn't mean outmatched. The tension was thick enough to cut as the two men stared each other down. Loretta clutched her purse tightly, her breathing shallow as she watched the scene unfold. "Isaiah, please," she said softly, her voice strained with worry. Paul let out a short laugh, motioning toward Troy and Gary. "Hear that? She's worried about you. Maybe she should be." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a taunting whisper. "You really think you can scare us? You don't belong here. Neither of you do." Isaiah's fists clenched at his sides, the restraint he was holding on to growing thinner with every second. "You don't get to decide where we belong, and you're not walking away from this." Troy chuckled, cracking his knuckles. "You think you're gonna stop us? There's 3 of us, and 1 of you. Pretty sure we win that fight." "Maybe we should show him," Paul said, his voice brimming with false confidence. "Teach him the same lesson we were teaching her." Isaiah tilted his head slightly, his sharp gaze sweeping over the 3 of them. "You don't want to do that." "Why not?" Paul shot back, his grin widening again. "Afraid?" Isaiah stepped even closer, his voice low and steady. "Afraid? No, but you should be." For a brief moment, the park seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind stilled as the tension reached its breaking point. Paul's sneer hardened, his body shifting forward, and Troy cracked his neck as he took another step toward Isaiah. The next move was inevitable. Paul's sneer twisted into a snarl, and before Isaiah could say another word, the wiry man lunged forward. His hands swung out in a clumsy attempt to grab Isaiah by the shirt, but Isaiah was faster. With a sharp sidestep, he dodged Paul's attack and planted his palm firmly against Paul's chest, shoving him backward. Paul stumbled but caught himself, his face red with fury. "You think you're tough?" he spat, motioning for Troy and Gary to join him. "Let's show him what happens when you mess with us." Troy cracked his knuckles, his bulky frame moving like a freight train toward Isaiah. "You're gonna regret this," he growled. Isaiah didn't flinch. Instead, his stance shifted slightly, feet grounded, hands ready. As Troy swung a wide fist toward him, Isaiah ducked under the blow and delivered a quick, precise jab to Troy's ribs. The larger man let out a grunt, staggering back a step. Gary hesitated, his confidence wavering. "Paul, maybe we should—" "Shut up and fight!" Paul snapped, his frustration boiling over. He charged at Isaiah again, this time aiming low, trying to tackle him. Isaiah anticipated the move, twisting to the side and locking Paul's arm. With a swift motion, he used Paul's momentum against him, flipping him onto the ground. Paul let out a pained grunt, but his fury only grew. "Get him!" he barked at the others. Troy recovered quickly, his face twisted in anger. He lunged again, throwing wild punches. Isaiah blocked and dodged each one with controlled movements, his training evident in the way he remained calm and precise. He waited for an opening, then struck with a sharp kick to Troy's knee, sending the larger man sprawling to the ground. Gary, wide-eyed and pale, took a few cautious steps back. "This guy's crazy," he muttered. "You're not going anywhere," Isaiah said, his voice cold and commanding. He turned toward Gary, who froze like a deer caught in headlights. "Stay right there." Paul, still on the ground, reached for a nearby rock, his eyes blazing with desperation. Loretta's sharp voice cut through the chaos. "Isaiah! Behind you!" Isaiah spun just as Paul lunged with the rock. He deflected the attack with his forearm and followed up with a swift strike to Paul's shoulder, forcing him to drop the weapon. With a quick motion, Isaiah pinned Paul to the ground, his knee pressing into his back. "Enough!" Isaiah's voice rang out, firm and unwavering. "It's over!" Troy groaned as he tried to push himself up from the ground, his movements slow and clumsy. Gary, however, took one look at Isaiah pinning Paul and bolted. "Forget this!" he shouted, sprinting down the path. "Coward!" Paul yelled after him, struggling under Isaiah's grip. Isaiah's focus stayed on Paul, his weight keeping the man firmly in place. "Stay down!" he said sharply. Troy, still clutching his side, began to stumble away, following Gary's lead. Isaiah's eyes flicked toward him, but he didn't move to stop him. His priority was keeping Paul subdued. Loretta approached cautiously, her hands clutching her purse as her breathing steadied. "Isaiah," she said softly, her voice laced with a mixture of relief and worry. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Mom," Isaiah said without looking up. "But we're not done yet." His eyes bore into Paul, who glared up at him with unrestrained hatred. "You think you've won?" Paul spat, his voice venomous. "This isn't over. You'll regret this." Isaiah leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "The only one who's going to regret anything is you." The sound of approaching sirens broke the tense silence, and for the first time, Paul's confidence wavered. His sneer faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "You called the cops?" he said, his tone incredulous. Isaiah's gaze didn't waver. "They're not here for a chat." Paul let out a bitter laugh, though it lacked his earlier bravado. "You'll see. They'll let me go. They always do." Isaiah's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned to Loretta. "Stay close to me. It's almost over." The faint wail of the sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of justice, or the beginning of the next chapter in their fight for it. The wail of the sirens grew louder, the flashing red and blue lights casting fleeting shadows across the park. Isaiah kept his knee pressed firmly against Paul's back, his eyes steady on the path where the officers would appear. Loretta stood nearby, clutching her purse, her expression a mix of relief and quiet resolve. Two uniformed officers rushed into view, their hands hovering near their holstered weapons as they took in the scene. A wiry man pinned to the ground, another limping away in the distance, and an older woman standing nearby. "What's going on here?" the lead officer demanded, his sharp tone cutting through the tension. His eyes flicked to Isaiah, clearly assessing him as a potential threat. Isaiah raised one hand slowly, keeping the other firmly planted on Paul's back. "Officer, this man assaulted my mother and attempted to rob her." His voice was calm and authoritative, his words measured. "I detained him to prevent further harm." Paul, despite his position, managed a bitter laugh. "Detained? You attacked me. They're gonna lock you up for this." Isaiah's lips tightened, but he didn't respond to Paul's outburst. Instead, he directed his attention back to the officers. "I have witnesses and evidence, and I'm prepared to give a full statement." The lead officer hesitated, glancing between Isaiah and Paul, who was writhing beneath Isaiah's knee. "We'll need you to step back, sir, so we can take control of the situation." Isaiah nodded and stood, lifting his hands to show he was compliant. As he stepped away, Paul scrambled to his knees, rubbing his shoulder and glaring at Isaiah with unbridled hatred. "You're done. You hear me?" he spat. "They'll take my word over yours any day." Isaiah reached into his jacket slowly, pulling out a leather badge case. With a flick of his wrist, he opened it, revealing the unmistakable insignia of the FBI. "Special Agent Isaiah Johnson," he said, his voice steady, "and I suggest you think very carefully about your next move." Paul froze, his sneer evaporating as the weight of Isaiah's words settled over him. His eyes darted to the badge, then back to Isaiah, disbelief and fear flickering across his face. "FBI?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. The lead officer's demeanor shifted instantly. His hand dropped from his weapon, and he straightened. "Agent Johnson," he said, nodding respectfully. We'll take it from here. Isaiah inclined his head, stepping back to allow the officers to approach Paul. Be careful, he said, his tone calm but firm. He's aggressive and has a history of violence. Paul's mouth opened and closed as though he wanted to argue, but no words came out. His earlier bravado had crumbled, replaced by a simmering fear. This is a setup, he finally blurted. He's lying. You can't trust him. The second officer stepped forward, pulling Paul's hands behind his back and snapping cuffs onto his wrists. You can explain that down at the station, he said curtly. Loretta, watching from the sidelines, let out a slow breath. Isaiah, she said softly, her voice filled with relief and pride. Thank you. Isaiah turned to her, his expression softening. Are you okay, Mom? He asked, his focus shifting entirely to her. I am now, she replied, her voice steady. She glanced at Paul, now subdued and far less threatening, before looking back at her son. He didn't expect you to be here. Isaiah's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking briefly to Paul. People like him think they can act without consequences. It's time he learns otherwise. As the officers began to lead Paul away, the wiry man twisted his neck to glare at Isaiah. You think you've won? This isn't over. Isaiah stepped closer, his gaze unyielding. It is over. For now. But trust me, the next time we meet, you'll be wishing you had walked away when you had the chance. Paul didn't respond, his shoulders slumping slightly as the officers guided him toward the patrol car. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed through the park, punctuating the shift in power. Isaiah turned back to Loretta, his expression softening once again. Let's get you home. Loretta nodded, her fingers brushing against the chain around her neck. I'm ready. Together, they began walking toward the park entrance, the tension of the moment giving way to the quiet resolve of what would come next. But in the back of Isaiah's mind, one thought lingered. Paul's accomplices were still out there, and this wasn't over. Not yet. Isaiah's mind was already turning over the next steps as he walked beside Loretta. Though Paul was in custody, Troy and Gary were still out there. Their escape gnawed at him, a loose thread in the fabric of justice he wasn't willing to leave undone. When they arrived at Loretta's home, the tension still hung heavy in the air. She set her purse carefully on the table and turned to face him, her expression soft but concerned. Isaiah, she began, her voice quiet, you've done enough for today. Paul's in custody. Isn't that enough? Isaiah shook his head, his jaw tightening. It's not enough, Mom. Troy and Gary ran, and you know they'll think they got away with it. I can't let that happen. Loretta sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. I know how you feel, but you've already done so much. More than anyone could ask. You were there when I needed you. And what about the next time? Isaiah's tone sharpened, though his eyes remained kind. What about someone else's mother or father or kid? If they're willing to do this once, they'll do it again. I have to stop them. Loretta frowned, crossing her arms. You think those men are worth all this effort? They're cowards, Isaiah. They'll trip over their own feet without you chasing them. That doesn't mean they shouldn't face consequences, Isaiah replied firmly. They targeted you because they thought no one would hold them accountable. I won't let them walk away like nothing happened. For a moment, silence hung between them. Finally, Loretta let out a resigned sigh, her expression softening. Just promise me you'll be careful. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you. Isaiah nodded, his voice lowering. I promise, Mom. I'll handle this. Loretta reached out, placing a hand on his arm. You always have to be the one to fix everything, she said softly. I'm proud of you for that. But don't lose yourself in the fight. Isaiah gave her a small smile. Don't worry, I know what I'm doing. Back at his apartment, Isaiah wasted no time. He reviewed the incident reports and began piecing together what little he knew about Troy and Gary. Using surveillance footage from nearby cameras, he traced their movements after they fled the park. His training kicked in, each clue sharpening his focus. A breakthrough came when he spotted Troy entering a convenience store near the outskirts of town. Cross-referencing the timestamp with the store's transaction records, he found an address tied to a credit card Troy had used. The location was a small, run-down house in a quiet neighborhood. The house was as neglected as Isaiah expected. Peeling paint, an overgrown lawn, and sagging shutters. He parked a few houses down, stepping out of his car with measured strides. Troy was sitting on the porch, a cigarette dangling from his lips. At first, he didn't notice Isaiah approaching, but when their eyes met, recognition dawned. Troy stood abruptly, his cigarette falling to the ground. "You," he said, his voice thick with anger and panic. "What the hell are you doing here?" Isaiah stopped at the edge of the porch, his tone calm but commanding. "You ran the other day, Troy. That doesn't change what you did." Troy's eyes darted around, searching for an escape route. "I didn't do anything. You got the wrong guy." Isaiah reached into his jacket and pulled out his badge, flipping it open. "Special Agent Isaiah Johnson, FBI. We both know what you did." The sight of the badge seemed to knock the air out of Troy. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His bravado crumbled as he took a shaky step backward. "FBI?" he finally managed to stammer. "That's right," Isaiah said, stepping closer. "And you're coming with me. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Panic set in. Troy's hand shot up in a defensive gesture as he stumbled back. "No way. You're not taking me in." Without warning, he bolted, leaping off the porch and sprinting down the street. Isaiah's reaction was instant. He launched after Troy, his long strides quickly closing the distance. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the quiet neighborhood. Troy's desperation gave him speed, but Isaiah's training gave him the edge. With a final burst of energy, Isaiah tackled him to the ground, pinning him with practiced precision. Troy thrashed and shouted, but it was no use. "Get off me!" Troy yelled, his voice tinged with both anger and fear. "You can't do this." Isaiah leaned in close, his voice steady and low. "You're under arrest. It's over." The sound of a patrol car pulling up signaled the end of the chase. Two officers stepped out, rushing to assist. Troy's resistance waned as the cuffs snapped onto his wrists, his head hanging low. Isaiah straightened, catching his breath. "One down," he muttered, his gaze hardening. "One more to go." But Gary wouldn't be easy to find. Isaiah knew the man was a follower, not a leader, but that made him unpredictable and potentially dangerous if cornered. He needed more information, and there were two people who might have it. The fluorescent lights in the interrogation room buzzed faintly, a constant hum that seemed to amplify the tension in the small space. Troy sat slouched in the metal chair, his cuffs glinting under the harsh light. His earlier defiance was gone, replaced by the nervous twitching of his fingers and the occasional dart of his eyes toward the mirror. Isaiah stepped inside, his calm demeanor masking the simmering anger beneath the surface. He set a slim folder on the table, pulling out a chair and sitting across from Troy with deliberate slowness. "Let me save you some time," Troy said, his voice tight. "I don't know where Gary is." Isaiah didn't respond immediately. Instead, he opened the folder, sliding a photo of Troy and Gary at the park across the table. "You expect me to believe that? You ran together. You worked together. You expect me to think he just vanished, and you have no idea where he might go?" Troy shifted uncomfortably, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of the table. "Look, I haven't seen him since that day. That's the truth." Isaiah leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "That's not good enough. You were there when he ran. He's your friend. You know how he thinks. You know where he might hide." Troy shook his head, his voice rising defensively. "Man, I don't know. Gary doesn't tell me everything. He's not the type to stick around. He's probably halfway out of the state by now." Isaiah's gaze didn't waver. "If you're lying, Troy, I'll find out, and when I do, you'll wish you'd cooperated." Troy swallowed hard, glancing at the photo again. "I swear, I don't know for sure. But Gary's not exactly the smartest guy. He panics easy. He might have gone to one of his usual spots." Isaiah's jaw tightened. "What spots?" Troy hesitated, then sighed. "He used to crash at motels when things got rough. And there's this bar on the south side he likes, the Iron Tankard." He hangs around there when he's got nowhere else to go. Isaiah's eyes narrowed. You better hope those are good leads. Troy raised his hand slightly, the cuffs clinking. That's all I've got, man. I swear. Paul was next. Isaiah entered the second interrogation room with the same measured calm, though his frustration had grown. Paul sat with his arms crossed, glaring at the mirror as though daring someone to meet his gaze. His lip curled when Isaiah entered. Back for more, Paul sneered. You got what you wanted, didn't you? I'm here. Troy's here. Why don't you leave Gary alone? He's not your problem. Isaiah pulled out a chair and sat, fixing Paul with an unyielding stare. You made him my problem the second you dragged my mother into this. Paul scoffed, leaning back in his chair. She got off easy. Could have been worse. Isaiah's hand slammed down on the table, the sound reverberating through the room. Don't you dare talk about her like that, he snapped, his voice cutting through Paul's facade. You think you're in control here? You're not. The only thing you've got left is the chance to make this easier on yourself. Paul smirked, though it wavered slightly. What do you want me to say? I don't know where Gary is. Isaiah leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low growl. But you have ideas. Don't play dumb with me. You've known him long enough to know where he'd go when he's scared. Paul's smirk disappeared, replaced by a defensive glare. He doesn't exactly keep me updated, Agent Johnson. Isaiah's eyebrows rose slightly. So, you know who I am? Good. Then you know I won't stop until I find him. And I'll make sure you pay for every lie you tell me. Paul flinched, but quickly masked it with a shrug. Gary's unpredictable. He's got a few places he likes. There's this dive bar he talks about, the Iron Tankard, and when he really wants to disappear, he goes to this old cabin his cousin owns, somewhere up north. Isaiah didn't break eye contact. Give me an address. I don't have one, Paul said, his voice growing defensive. It's out in the woods, miles from anything. He only goes there when he's desperate. Isaiah studied him for a long moment before standing and gathering the file. If I find out you're holding back, Paul, I'll be back. And it won't be a conversation next time. Paul's glare followed him out the door, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his unease. Back in his office, Isaiah cross-referenced the information. 2 leads emerged, the Iron Tankard and a possible connection to the cabin. Both required immediate attention, and Isaiah knew the clock was ticking. Gary wouldn't stay hidden for long. Isaiah parked a few blocks away from the Iron Tankard, a dive bar that looked every bit as run down as he'd expected. Its cracked neon sign flickered erratically, and the faint sound of laughter and clinking glasses spilled into the night. Isaiah remained in his car for a moment, watching the patrons come and go, scanning each face for Gary. The bar was one of the places Troy and Paul had mentioned, exactly the kind of spot where someone like Gary would lay low. Isaiah stepped out of his car, his FBI badge tucked out of sight, and approached the entrance with measured steps. The air smelled of stale beer and cigarette smoke as he pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, the haze of smoke hanging low over sticky floors and mismatched furniture. A handful of patrons sat at the bar, nursing their drinks, while a small group played pool in the back corner. Isaiah's eyes swept over the room, his trained gaze picking apart details until he spotted a figure hunched over a beer at the far end of the bar. Gary. Isaiah's chest tightened with focus. He walked slowly toward him, weaving through the tables and ignoring the curious glances of the other patrons. As he neared, Gary glanced up, his eyes widening as recognition flashed across his face. Gary's reaction was instant. His chair scraped against the floor as he bolted upright, knocking over his drink. No, 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 he muttered, stumbling backward as Isaiah closed the distance. Gary, Isaiah said, his voice firm and calm, though his presence radiated authority. It's over. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Gary's hands shot up defensively, his breathing ragged. I didn't do anything. This isn't about me. It was Paul. Paul's the one you want. Isaiah's expression didn't waver. Paul's in custody, and so is Troy. You're the last one. Sit down, and we'll talk about how this ends." Gary's eyes darted around the room, panic setting in, as he realized he was cornered. The bartender and a few patrons were watching now, their curiosity piqued. "I'm not going with you," Gary said, his voice shaking. "You're not taking me in." "You don't have a choice," Isaiah said evenly, his tone unwavering. "You can cooperate, or we can do this the hard way." For a moment, Gary froze, his panicked gaze flicking between Isaiah and the exit. Then, with a desperate grunt, he shoved a nearby table toward Isaiah and bolted for the back door. Isaiah reacted instantly, sidestepping the table and sprinting after him. "Stop, Gary!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the bar. Patrons scrambled out of the way as the chase spilled into the alley behind the building. The cold night air hit Isaiah's face as he emerged into the narrow alley, Gary already a few steps ahead, his feet pounding against the pavement. Isaiah's training kicked in as he closed the distance, his movements precise and controlled. "Gary, stop now!" Isaiah shouted again, his voice cutting through the night. Gary glanced over his shoulder, his face a mask of fear. "Leave me alone!" he yelled, his desperation fueling his flight. He darted around a dumpster, nearly losing his footing as he turned sharply into a side street. Isaiah stayed on him, his breathing steady despite the exertion. Gary's movements were erratic, each turn and stumble betraying his growing exhaustion. Finally, in an empty lot bordered by chain-link fencing, Gary's luck ran out. He tripped over a loose piece of concrete, sprawling onto the ground with a pained shout. Isaiah was on him in an instant, flipping him onto his back and pinning him with practiced efficiency. Gary struggled weakly, his strength sapped by the chase. "You don't have to do this," he gasped. "I'll tell you everything. Just don't take me in." Isaiah pulled out his cuffs, his voice firm. "You've had plenty of chances, Gary. This is over." The click of the cuffs locking around Gary's wrists seemed to drain the fight from him. He slumped against the pavement, his chest heaving as he muttered under his breath. "Paul said we wouldn't get caught." "He said." Isaiah ignored him, hauling him to his feet. The sound of approaching sirens signaled the arrival of the backup he had called during the chase. Gary's eyes widened at the flashing lights, his defiance giving way to despair. As the officers took Gary into custody, Isaiah stood back, watching in silence. His breathing was steady, but his mind raced. The hunt was over, but the fight for justice wasn't finished yet. He pulled out his phone, dialing the precinct. "I've got him," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "It's time to make sure they all face what's coming." The next morning, Isaiah parked outside Loretta's modest home, his body still carrying the tension from the night before. The capture of all three men brought a measure of relief, but he knew the journey was far from over. He carried a file folder under his arm as he walked up the front steps and knocked on the door. Loretta answered quickly, her warm smile dimming when she saw the weight in his eyes. "Isaiah," she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. "You look tired. Have you eaten?" "I'm fine, Mom," he said, leaning down to kiss her cheek before stepping inside. The aroma of fresh coffee greeted him, along with the familiar sense of comfort her home always provided. "But we need to talk." Loretta motioned for him to sit at the kitchen table while she poured 2 mugs of coffee. "I take it you found the last one?" she asked as she joined him, setting a steaming cup in front of him. Isaiah nodded, setting the file folder on the table. "Gary's in custody. All 3 of them are. But it's not enough to just arrest them. The case against them needs to be airtight, and your testimony will make all the difference." Loretta's fingers tightened around her mug as she absorbed his words. Her eyes were steady, but there was a flicker of hesitation. "You want me to press charges?" "I don't want you to do anything you're not ready for," Isaiah said carefully. "But if we're going to make sure they face justice, we need your voice. You were the victim, Mom. They targeted you, and they need to be held accountable for it." Loretta took a deep breath, setting her mug down. "Isaiah, I've spent my whole life brushing off people like them, pretending it didn't matter, trying to convince myself that the hate would pass if I just stayed quiet." Her gaze met his, her voice growing stronger. "But this time, it's different. They didn't just insult me. They tried to hurt me, to take something from me. And they did it because they thought no one would care. They're wrong, Isaiah said firmly. People will care. The courts will care. I know, Loretta said, her voice resolute. That's why I'm not staying quiet this time. I'll press charges. I'll testify. Whatever it takes to make sure they don't do this to anyone else. Isaiah exhaled, a small smile breaking through his serious expression. I knew you'd say that. Loretta returned his smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. I'm not doing this just for me, Isaiah. I'm doing it for you, for your future. So you don't have to live in a world where people like them think they can get away with anything. Isaiah reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. And I'll be right there with you, every step of the way. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared determination filling the room. Finally, Loretta spoke again, her tone lighter but still firm. You know this isn't going to be easy. I never expected it to be, Isaiah said with a smirk. But they picked the wrong family to mess with. Loretta chuckled softly, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. You've always been stubborn, just like your father. Guess I come by it honestly, Isaiah replied, lifting his mug in a small toast. They clinked their cups together, a moment of quiet resolve shared between mother and son. The road ahead would be challenging, but they were ready to face it together. The next day, Isaiah stood in the precinct's conference room, leaning over a cluttered table as he reviewed a growing stack of documents. The dim overhead light illuminated the files spread before him, police reports, mugshots, and a map marked with pins indicating incidents linked to Paul, Troy, and Gary. Each case had a chilling commonality. The victims were people of color. Beside him, Melanie Carter, the lead prosecutor, tapped a finger on one of the reports. It's not just about what they did to your mother, she said grimly. This isn't an isolated incident. These men have a pattern, Isaiah. Isaiah nodded, his jaw tightening. They've been targeting people for years. Black families, immigrant business owners, anyone they think is an easy target. They act like no one's watching. Melanie flipped through another file, shaking her head. Most of these cases never made it to court. Insufficient evidence. Witnesses too scared to testify. They've been skating under the radar. Not anymore, Isaiah said firmly. We're not just going after them for what they did to my mom. We're going to build the biggest case possible. These guys need to be taken off the streets for good. The digging began in earnest. Isaiah spent days poring over old police reports, reaching out to victims and witnesses who had crossed paths with Paul, Troy, and Gary. The pattern became undeniable. The trio specifically targeted people they thought wouldn't or couldn't fight back. One report detailed a harassment incident outside a grocery store, where Paul and Troy cornered a young Hispanic man and accused him of stealing. When the man tried to leave, they blocked his path, shouting racial slurs until a bystander intervened. Another case involved an elderly black couple whose home had been vandalized with racial epithets spray-painted across their fence. Though no one had been charged, neighbors had seen Paul and Gary lurking in the area. Isaiah tracked down one of the victims, a cashier at a convenience store who had been harassed and assaulted by the trio. When he met her at the store, her expression was wary as he introduced himself. I know this is painful, Isaiah said gently, but we're building a case against these men. If you're willing to share your story, it could help ensure they never do this to anyone else. She hesitated, her hands trembling as she adjusted her apron. They called me names, she whispered. Said I didn't belong here. When I told them to leave, they threw cans at me. One of them hit me in the arm. Her voice broke, but she straightened. If it means they finally face justice, I'll talk. The deeper Isaiah dug, the uglier the picture became. Surveillance footage from a gas station showed Paul knocking over a display rack while shouting slurs at the attendant, who appeared too frightened to confront him. A former bar owner confirmed that Paul had threatened one of his bartenders, a woman of Asian descent, after she refused to serve him. Each piece of evidence painted a chilling portrait of their escalating violence. Isaiah sat with Melanie late one evening, the table between them covered in documents. This is a pattern of racially motivated crimes, Isaiah said, pointing to the stack of reports. They've been getting bolder, targeting anyone they think they can intimidate. Melanie nodded, her expression grim. This is more than just one bad day. This is hate. And it's going to be our job to make sure the jury sees that. When the time came to confront the men with their crimes, Isaiah knew they'd deny everything. He started with Troy, whose nervous energy gave him away the moment Isaiah stepped into the interrogation room. "You're back," Troy muttered, slumping in his chair. "What now?" Isaiah dropped a stack of photos on the table. Images of vandalized homes, assaulted victims, and the hateful graffiti they'd left behind. "This is what now," Isaiah said sharply. "These aren't just isolated incidents. This is a hate campaign." Troy's eyes flicked to the photos, then back to Isaiah. "I didn't do all that," he said quickly. "Paul's the one who started it. He gets angry, and we just follow along." Isaiah leaned forward, his voice cold. "You didn't stop him, though. You threw cans at a cashier. You painted slurs on fences. You were there every step of the way." Troy's shoulders sagged. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. It wasn't my idea." "It doesn't matter whose idea it was," Isaiah said firmly. "You're just as guilty. The only way you help yourself now is by coming clean. Tell us everything." Troy hesitated, his eyes darting to the mirrored glass. Finally, he let out a shaky breath. "Okay," he muttered. "I'll talk." The information Troy provided only deepened the case. He recounted Paul's rants about teaching lessons to people he claimed didn't belong in their town. He described how Paul had orchestrated most of the attacks, with Troy and Gary acting as willing enforcers. As Isaiah left the interrogation room, he glanced back at Troy. The man looked smaller now, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. "Paul won't protect you," Isaiah said. "The only thing you can do now is tell the truth." The atmosphere in the second interrogation room was charged with tension. Paul sat across the table, his defiant posture a stark contrast to Troy's earlier nervousness. His lips curled into a sneer as Isaiah entered, shutting the door behind him. Paul leaned back in his chair, his cuffs clinking softly as he folded his arms. "Well, if it isn't the hero," Paul drawled, his tone laced with mockery. "What are you here for now? Didn't you get enough?" Isaiah ignored the jab, dropping a folder onto the table with a thud. He took his seat opposite Paul, his movements measured. "I'm here to give you a chance," he said evenly. "A chance to explain yourself before the evidence does it for you." Paul chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, I get it. You think you've got me all figured out, don't you? Think you're gonna pin everything on me?" Isaiah opened the folder, revealing a collection of photos, reports, and transcripts. He slid one of the photos across the table, an image of the vandalized fence, with slurs scrawled in bold letters. "This was you, wasn't it?" Paul glanced at the photo but didn't respond, his smirk unwavering. Isaiah continued, his tone calm but firm. "We have witnesses who saw you there. Your fingerprints are on the spray Ken we recovered, and Troy's already confirmed you led the group." At the mention of Troy, Paul's smirk faltered. "Troy's a coward," he snapped. "He'll say anything to save his own skin." "Maybe," Isaiah said, leaning forward slightly. "But the evidence doesn't lie. We know this wasn't an isolated incident. You've been targeting people, black families, immigrant-owned businesses, anyone you thought couldn't fight back." Paul scoffed, though the flicker of unease in his eyes didn't escape Isaiah. "You don't know a damn thing about me." "I know you've spent years trying to make people feel powerless," Isaiah said, his voice hardening. "And now that you're the one caught, you can't handle it." Paul's jaw tightened, but he quickly masked it with another sneer. "You think you're better than me? You think locking me up will change anything? It'll stop you from hurting anyone else," Isaiah shot back. "And it'll show people like you that there are consequences." Paul leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You think the system cares about your justice?" "I've been through this before, Agent Johnson. I'll be out in no time." Isaiah's gaze didn't waver. "Not this time. We're not just charging you for what you did to my mother. We've got a string of racially motivated crimes tied to you. Vandalism, harassment, assault. Each one a nail in your coffin. Paul's bravado cracked, his smirk fading. You think you're so smart, he muttered, his voice lower now, but you don't know everything. Isaiah seized on the shift, his tone sharpening. Then why don't you enlighten me, Paul? If you've got something to say, now's your chance. Paul hesitated, his defiance wavering. He glanced at the folder, then back at Isaiah. Gary's the one you want, he said finally. He's the one who loses control. I just keep things in line. Isaiah raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. You're trying to pass the blame onto Gary? That's rich. Everyone knows you're the ringleader. Paul slammed his fists against the table, the cuffs rattling loudly. I didn't force anyone to do anything. They followed me because they wanted to. Gary's just as guilty as me, maybe more. Isaiah leaned back, his calm demeanor unshaken. Good. You can tell the jury all about it. Paul glared at him, his breathing heavy, but said nothing more. Isaiah stepped out of the interrogation room, his mind racing as he processed Paul's words. The man's attempt to deflect responsibility only reinforced what Isaiah already knew. Paul was the linchpin of their operation. The testimonies from Troy and Gary would cement the case, but Paul's downfall would come from his inability to admit he'd lost control. Back in the precinct's conference room, Isaiah met with Melanie to review the latest developments. Paul's digging his own grave, Isaiah said, handing over his notes. He's trying to shift blame onto Gary, but we've got enough to show he was the one calling the shots. Melanie flipped through the notes, nodding. Troy's confession is solid, and the pattern of racially motivated crimes ties everything together. With Paul's arrogance, we might even get him to incriminate himself further on the stand. Isaiah's jaw tightened. Let's make sure we're ready for that. I don't want him slipping through the cracks. Melanie smiled faintly. With this much evidence, he won't. The precinct conference room had become Isaiah's second home. The table was covered with files, photographs, and stacks of handwritten notes. Loretta sat across from him, her face calm but resolute, as she sifted through the timeline of events. Beside them, Melanie Carter reviewed her opening statement, her sharp eyes scanning the pages with practiced precision. Everything's falling into place, Melanie said, looking up. We've got Troy's confession, surveillance footage, the vandalism reports, and Loretta's testimony. The jury will see exactly what kind of people we're dealing with. Loretta nodded, though a shadow of doubt crossed her face. It's just, they're going to try to make me look unreliable, aren't they? Isaiah leaned forward, his voice steady. They'll try, but they can't twist the truth, Mom. You've been nothing but honest from the start. Just stick to the facts. Melanie chimed in, her tone encouraging. Exactly. And you have something they don't. Credibility. Paul, Troy, and Gary have a long history of lies and violence. The evidence is on your side. Loretta took a deep breath, nodding slowly. I know. I just want to make sure they don't get away with this. They won't, Isaiah said firmly. Not this time. Over the next few days, the team worked tirelessly to finalize their case. Isaiah and Melanie reviewed every piece of evidence, ensuring no detail was overlooked. They interviewed witnesses, refining their statements, and pieced together a cohesive narrative that would resonate with the jury. One night, as Isaiah sat alone in the conference room, he reviewed Troy's confession again. His words painted a chilling picture of Paul's manipulative nature and the trio's long history of targeting vulnerable communities. They didn't belong here, Troy had said, his voice shaking. That's what Paul always said, that it was up to us to teach them a lesson. Isaiah's fist clenched as he read the transcript. The hate behind those words was palpable, and it fueled his determination to see this through. At Loretta's home, Isaiah helped her prepare for her testimony. They sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of tea in front of each of them. Loretta tapped her fingers against the side of her mug, her gaze distant. What if I freeze up? She asked quietly. What if I can't find the right words? Isaiah reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. You won't. You've already lived through the worst part of this. Now it's about telling your story. Just speak from the heart, and the truth will come through." Loretta smiled faintly, her grip tightening around his hand. "You've always believed in me, even when I doubted myself, and I always will," Isaiah said. "You're stronger than you think, Mom." They rehearsed her testimony late into the evening, going over potential questions and practicing responses. Isaiah played the role of the defense attorney, pushing her with difficult questions to ensure she was prepared for anything. By the end, Loretta's confidence had grown, her voice steady and sure. The prosecution team also prepared for the testimony of the accomplice who had turned on Paul. Isaiah worked closely with Melanie to ensure Troy's confession would hold up under scrutiny. They anticipated the defense's attempts to discredit him and built a strategy to counter every possible angle. "He's not a saint," Melanie admitted during one strategy meeting, "but his testimony is crucial. If we present it right, the jury will see him for what he is. Someone who's finally come clean, even if it's out of fear." Isaiah nodded. "Paul will try to paint him as a liar, but the evidence backs him up. The pattern of behavior is undeniable." As the trial date approached, the weight of the case settled over all of them. Loretta maintained her quiet strength, her resolve unwavering despite the emotional toll. Isaiah worked late into the nights, driven by the need to see justice served. And Melanie, sharp and methodical, ensured that every detail was accounted for. On the eve of the trial, Loretta and Isaiah sat together in the living room, the hum of the television filling the silence. Isaiah leaned back on the couch, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "You've been working non-stop," Loretta said softly. "You need to rest." "I'll rest when it's over," Isaiah replied, though his tone lacked the usual sharpness. "This is too important to get wrong." Loretta reached over, placing a hand on his arm. "You've done everything you can, Isaiah. Now it's in their hands." Isaiah turned to her, his expression softening. "We've done everything we can. You've been incredible through all of this, Mom. I'm proud of you." Loretta smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And I'm proud of you. No matter what happens, Isaiah, we've already won." "They didn't silence us." Isaiah nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to relax, even if just for a moment. Tomorrow would be a battle, but they were ready. The courtroom fell silent as Loretta Johnson was called to the stand. She rose with quiet dignity, her modest navy suit a sharp contrast to the tension in the air. Her steps were steady as she approached the witness chair, her posture straight but not rigid. After being sworn in, she sat down, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes briefly meeting Isaiah's in the front row. His steady presence seemed to give her strength. Melanie Carter, the lead prosecutor, approached the stand with measured steps, her tone gentle but authoritative. "Mrs. Johnson, thank you for being here today. I know this hasn't been easy for you." Loretta nodded, her voice calm as she replied, "I'm here because it's the right thing to do." Melanie gave a slight nod before beginning. "Let's start with that day in the park. Can you describe what you were doing?" Loretta took a deep breath, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I was sitting on a bench, waiting for my son. It was a nice afternoon, and I thought the park would be a peaceful place to meet. I didn't think anything of it." "And what happened while you were sitting there?" Melanie asked, stepping closer to the jury as she spoke. Loretta's hands tightened slightly in her lap. "3 men walked over to me," she said, her tone sharpening. "At first, I thought they were just passing by, but they stopped right in front of me. That's when they started talking." "Talking?" Melanie asked, her tone gentle but leading. "What exactly did they say?" Loretta paused, her gaze momentarily dropping to her hands. When she looked up again, her voice was firm. "They called me names. Terrible names. They said I didn't belong there, that people like me shouldn't be in their park." Melanie took a moment to let the weight of Loretta's words settle in the room. The jury shifted in their seats, some glancing toward the defendants, who avoided their gaze. "And how did you respond, Mrs. Johnson?" Melanie asked. "I told them to leave me alone," Loretta said. "I tried to ignore them, but they wouldn't stop. They got louder, more aggressive. It wasn't just words anymore. It was the way they stood over me. The way they looked at me. It was threatening. Did they make any specific threats? Melanie pressed. Yes, Loretta said, her voice rising slightly. They said no one would care what happened to me, that no one would believe me. They said they could do whatever they wanted, and I wouldn't be able to stop them. Melanie nodded, her expression calm but intense. What happened next? Loretta's gaze flicked briefly toward the defendants before returning to Melanie. Paul Carter grabbed my wrist, she said, her voice tight with emotion. He tried to take my purse. When I pulled back, he yanked harder. It hurt. Melanie held up a photograph of Loretta's wrist, the faint bruises visible even in the slightly grainy image. Is this a photograph of your wrist taken shortly after the incident? Yes, Loretta said. It's from when they documented the injuries. Melanie placed the photo on the evidence table, letting the jury get a good look at it. What about the others? Did they assist Paul? They stood there, Loretta said, her voice tinged with frustration. They didn't try to stop him. One of them laughed. The other one blocked me from getting up. It was like they were daring me to fight back. Melanie paused, her gaze steady on Loretta. At any point, did anyone else step in to help you? Loretta's expression softened slightly, and for the first time, her voice wavered. Yes, she said. My son, Isaiah, arrived. He stopped them before it got worse. Melanie smiled faintly. Your son stepped in and defended you. Loretta nodded, her hands tightening in her lap. If he hadn't shown up when he did, I don't know what would have happened. They weren't going to stop on their own. Melanie walked to the jury box, her tone steady but firm. Mrs. Johnson, can you tell the jury how this experience has affected you? Loretta took a deep breath, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I've lived a long life, she said, and I've faced racism before. But this was different. It wasn't just hateful words. It was the way they made me feel like I didn't matter, like I wasn't even human. It's something I'll never forget. She turned her gaze directly to the jury, her voice rising slightly, but I refuse to let them silence me. That's why I'm here. Because what they did was wrong, and someone has to say it. Melanie nodded, stepping back to her table. No further questions, Your Honor. The prosecution's case had begun with a powerful foundation, but the fight was far from over. As the courtroom settled, the defense attorney, Mark Hensley, rose from his seat. He was a tall man with a crisp suit and a deliberate air of confidence, every movement calculated to project authority. He adjusted his tie as he approached the witness stand, his expression a mix of feigned sympathy and sharp intent. Mrs. Johnson, Hensley began, his tone polite but edged. Thank you for your testimony. I'd like to ask you a few questions, if that's all right. Loretta nodded, her expression calm and resolute. Of course. Hensley paced slowly in front of the jury, his hands clasped behind his back. You've stated that my clients approached you in the park and made comments you found offensive. Can you tell us exactly what those comments were? They called me names, Loretta said firmly. They said I didn't belong there, that people like me had no place in their park. Hensley stopped pacing, turning to face her with a slight frown. People like you, those are your words. Isn't it possible you misunderstood their intent? Loretta raised an eyebrow, her voice steady. No, I didn't misunderstand. They made their intent perfectly clear. And yet, Hensley continued, his tone growing sharper, you claim they threatened you, but no physical harm occurred until my client allegedly grabbed your wrist. Is that correct? Loretta's gaze didn't waver. He didn't allegedly grab my wrist. He did, and he tried to take my purse. Hensley stepped closer to the jury, his voice softening as if confiding in them. Mrs. Johnson, emotions can run high in situations like this. Isn't it possible that in the heat of the moment, you misinterpreted their actions? Perhaps they were simply trying to engage you in conversation. Loretta's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. If grabbing my wrist and calling me slurs is your idea of conversation, then we have a very different understanding of the word. There was a ripple of murmurs from the spectators, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Hensley pressed on, though his confident facade had slipped slightly. You've mentioned feeling scared. But fear can distort perception, can't it? Isn't it possible you exaggerated what happened because you were afraid? Loretta leaned forward slightly, her tone unwavering. I didn't exaggerate anything. I told the truth about what they did. Hensley's expression tightened. He pivoted to a different approach, flipping through his notes. Mrs. Johnson, you've lived in this neighborhood for years, haven't you? Yes, Loretta replied. And during that time, have you ever had issues with my clients before? No, Loretta said. But that doesn't change. What happened? Interesting, Hensley said, raising an eyebrow. So, this was the first time you'd ever encountered them? Yet you're certain of their intent? Even though you'd never spoken to them before? Loretta's gaze was steady. I don't need to know someone to understand hate when I see it. Isaiah, seated in the gallery, clenched his fists, willing himself to stay composed. He could see the frustration flickering across Hensley's face as Loretta refused to be rattled. Hensley took a deep breath, adjusting his approach again. One final question, Mrs. Johnson. You've testified that you were waiting for your son in the park that day. Isn't it possible that your son's arrival escalated the situation? That perhaps, had he not intervened so aggressively, this entire misunderstanding could have been resolved peacefully? Loretta's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing slightly. If my son hadn't arrived, I might not be here to testify. Your clients weren't interested in resolving anything peacefully. They wanted to scare me, to hurt me. My son stopped them before they could go any further. Hensley hesitated, clearly thrown by her response. After a brief pause, he stepped back. No further questions, Your Honor. Loretta stepped down from the stand with quiet dignity, her head held high as she returned to her seat beside Isaiah. He gave her a small nod, his pride evident. Hensley returned to his table, whispering furiously to Paul, whose scowl deepened as he glanced toward the jury. The defense's attempt to discredit Loretta had faltered, and the weight of her testimony lingered heavily in the air. The courtroom was tense as Mark Hensley, the defense attorney, rose to address the jury. His crisp suit and confident demeanor projected an air of control as he adjusted his tie and strode to the center of the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Hensley began, his voice smooth and polished. My clients stand accused of heinous acts, but I urge you to consider this case not through the lens of emotion, but through the lens of reason. He paced slowly, his gaze sweeping the jury. We've heard compelling testimony from Mrs. Johnson, and while her account is undoubtedly heartfelt, it is not without flaws. Memory, as we all know, can be a tricky thing, especially in moments of high stress. And while my clients may have acted in ways that could be perceived as inappropriate, the prosecution would have you believe it was a calculated act of hate. Hensley paused, letting the words hang in the air. But where is the concrete proof? Words can be misinterpreted. Actions can be misunderstood. What we have here are allegations, not certainties. He turned toward the defendants, gesturing with an open hand. Paul Carter, Troy Howard, and Gary Mills are hard-working men, members of this community, who, while imperfect, are being painted as villains in a story based on assumptions and circumstantial evidence. Hensley's tone sharpened as he addressed the jury again. Think about the evidence presented. A bruised wrist, photographs of vandalism, and the testimony of a man, Troy Howard, who would say anything to save himself. Is this enough to condemn 3 men to years in prison? To brand them as racists, as criminals? Hensley stepped closer to the jury box, lowering his voice for dramatic effect. Before you decide, remember, doubt is not the enemy of justice. It is its safeguard. And if there is any doubt in your mind about the intentions of my clients, you must give them the benefit of it. He stepped back, his expression resolute. Thank you. The judge addressed the jury as Hensley took his seat. You've heard from both sides. You've seen the evidence. Now, it is your responsibility to deliberate and reach a verdict. Bailiff, escort the jury to the deliberation room. The jury rose, their faces solemn, and filed out of the courtroom. The door closed behind them with a heavy thud, leaving the remaining attendees in a charged silence. Loretta glanced at Isaiah, her hand tightening around her purse. Isaiah offered a small nod. His jaw clenched. "It's out of our hands now," he whispered. Loretta exhaled softly. "I just hope they see the truth." The judge cleared his throat. "Court will reconvene once the jury has reached a verdict." The courtroom doors opened, and the jury filed back in, their faces solemn and unreadable. The foreperson, a composed middle-aged woman, held a folded piece of paper tightly in her hands as she approached the bailiff. The air was thick with tension, every sound amplified. The rustling of the paper, the shuffle of feet, the faint creak of chairs as everyone adjusted to the weight of the moment. Isaiah sat beside Loretta, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He glanced at her, noting the calm determination in her face. Though her hands trembled slightly, her resolve was unshaken. "Whatever happens, Mom," he whispered, "we've done everything we can." Loretta nodded, her gaze fixed on the jury box. "I know. I just hope it's enough." "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the room collectively stood as the judge entered. Once seated, the judge gestured toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson stood, her expression steady but serious. "We have, Your Honor." "Please pass the verdict to the bailiff." The foreperson complied, handing over the folded piece of paper. The bailiff delivered it to the judge, who unfolded it with deliberate care. His eyes scanned the paper briefly before looking up. "Will the defendants please rise?" Paul, Troy, and Gary stood at the defense table, their expressions a study in contrasts. Paul's face was set in a sneer, his defiance unbroken. Troy looked pale, his hands trembling slightly, while Gary's eyes darted around the room, a sheen of sweat visible on his forehead. The judge turned back to the jury. "In the matter of the people versus Paul Carter, Troy Howard, and Gary Mills, how does the jury find?" The foreperson cleared her throat, her voice steady. "We find the defendants guilty on all counts." A ripple of murmurs swept through the room, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Isaiah felt a wave of relief as Loretta exhaled quietly beside him, her hands still trembling, but her expression resolute. The judge adjusted his glasses, his gaze falling on the defendants. "Paul Carter, as the ringleader of this racially motivated attack, your actions were not only malicious, but calculated. You targeted Mrs. Johnson because of her race, believing she was vulnerable and alone. The evidence presented has shown a pattern of hate-fueled behavior over several years." He paused, his voice cold and steady. "For your crimes, you are sentenced to 18 years in prison, without the possibility of parole." Paul's sneer vanished, replaced by a flash of fear and anger. "This is a joke!" he shouted, his voice echoing in the courtroom. Deputies stepped closer, their hands ready to restrain him. The judge ignored the outburst, turning to Troy. "Troy Howard, while you participated in this attack and others like it, your cooperation with the prosecution has been noted. However, this does not absolve you of responsibility. You are sentenced to 15 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 10. Troy visibly sagged, his shoulders drooping as the weight of his sentence sank in. Finally, the judge addressed Gary. "Gary Mills, your involvement, while less direct, was no less harmful. You stood by and allowed these acts to occur, contributing to the harm caused. You are sentenced to 12 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 8. Gary's head dropped, his face pale as deputies stepped forward to place him in handcuffs. The judge banged his gavel once more. "This court is adjourned. Let this serve as a reminder that acts of hate and violence have no place in our society and will not go unpunished." As the defendants were led out of the courtroom, Paul turned his head, his voice dripping with venom. "You think this is over? You think you've won?" Isaiah met his glare with an unflinching stare. "It's over, Paul. You just don't realize it yet." Outside the courtroom, Loretta and Isaiah stood on the courthouse steps, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows. Reporters swarmed, microphones and cameras thrust toward them. Isaiah shielded Loretta from the chaos, guiding her through the crowd. Once inside the car, Loretta let out a long breath, her hands clasped tightly. "They're going to pay for what they did," she said quietly. Isaiah nodded, his voice steady. "They are, and they won't hurt anyone else." The days following the sentencing were quiet, a stark contrast to the intensity of the trial. Loretta sat on her porch, a steaming cup of tea in her hands, as the soft light of the setting sun bathed the yard in warmth. Isaiah joined her, settling into the chair beside her, his presence a calming anchor. "They're gone now," Loretta said, her voice soft. "Locked away, where they can't hurt anyone else." Isaiah nodded, his gaze on the horizon. "It doesn't erase what they did, but it stops them from doing it again. That's something." Loretta sipped her tea, her hands steady now. "I've lived with this kind of hate for a long time, Isaiah, but standing up in that courtroom, it felt different. Like I wasn't just fighting for myself, but for everyone who's ever felt the same way." "You were incredible, Mom," Isaiah said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "You didn't just stand up for yourself. You showed people that silence isn't the only option." She turned to him, her smile faint but genuine. "And you, Isaiah. You've been my rock through all of this. I don't know how I would have done it without you." Isaiah leaned back, his expression contemplative. "We did it together, and now, maybe, things will start to change." Loretta nodded, her eyes glistening. "Maybe, and if not, we'll keep fighting, for the next person, and the one after that." The two sat in silence for a while, the weight of the past weeks slowly lifting. The world outside still held its challenges, but for now, in this moment, they had found a measure of peace.